What the UFO? I'm Caleb. I'm going to talk you through a UFO op-ed I just wrote a couple weeks ago, and then I'm going to analyze it in a little more depth at the end. So this is going to start with a breezy pitch for why it's very rational to believe UFOs are probably non-human intelligence, and it's kind of fringy to believe that they're not non-human intelligence. And then I'm going to break that down, expand on any points I think I could. I might chat through it a little bit, but I'm going to try to stick to mostly the essay format for at least this first several minutes, however long it takes me to read this op-ed. It's a little bit on the breezy side. It's not a super deep dive, and that's because op-ed requirements tend to clock in around 800 words. So this is an attempt to narrow down the argument that NHI are the most likely solution to the UFO question to the most approachable, bare bones, entry level package that I possibly can. But as I'm sure you'll intuit in listening to it, there are lots of places where we could expand and go into greater detail. So I hope you might find this useful if you're new to UFOs or if you're trying to explain why you're so interested in them to people who also don't know much about them. Okay, without further ado, I'm calling this UFO Skepticism is the Real Fringe Theory. And it starts, we're in a scientific revolution. Philosopher Thomas Kuhn coined this phrase in 1962 to describe paradigm shifts in our understanding of reality. Before these shifts, Kuhn said, our consensus views are either incorrect or incomplete, triggering a crisis when our dominant theories fail to explain persistent anomalies. After we update our paradigm, regular science resumes. Today, we find ourselves in such a crisis regarding UFOs, aka UAP. Humanity may soon look back on this moment the way we look back on the days before Einstein, Galileo, and Darwin, amazed by our former ignorance. For at least 80 years, anomalous evidence has suggested non-human technology may be visiting Earth. Millions have seen strange objects, thousands have met strange beings, dozens have reported secret military projects. Despite all this, most people think aliens aren't visiting, and all UFO have Earth-based explanations. In 2022, intelligence officials from the US told the United States Congress that some UAP are physical objects, leaving only the question of whether they're human or non-human. Many have understandably assumed the human hypothesis is more likely, but this theory has surprisingly weak explanatory power. For one thing, it can't easily explain the 2004 encounters by the USS Nimitz carrier group, which for 2 weeks tracked objects descending from above 80,000 feet and coming rapidly down to 20,000 feet, where they would stay for hours and then go straight back up. It likewise struggles with the Tic Tac object encountered by Nimitz pilots, which demonstrated abilities Commander David Fravor described to Congress in 2023 as, quote, far superior to anything that we had at the time, have today, or are looking to develop in the next 10 plus years. Most important, the human theory strains to account for 8 decades of sightings in which apparently technological craft significantly outperformed the best planes of the time. The dozens of such events with highly qualified sources include the Belgian wave in 1989 to 90, the Tehran incident in 1976, the DC flap in 1952, and the famous flying saucer sighting by Kenneth Arnold in 1947. Is it possible some sightings are mistakes? Of course. Is it likely that every single one is an error, including objects reported by teams of military pilots, tracked on multiple sensors, or seen by thousands of witnesses? That certainly is not intuitive. Finally, the human hypothesis must confront statements from high-ranking officials. The first head of the CIA, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, said in 1960 that these unknown objects were, quote, operating under intelligent control, and that in the years after World War II, quote, neither Russia nor this country had anything even approaching such high speeds and maneuvers. As Ohio State philosophy professor Stephen Brown notes in his lectures about UFO epistemology, the combination of modern and historical sightings presents a significant logical problem for the human hypothesis. Proponents must embrace an elaborate, counterintuitive conspiracy theory that humans somehow developed highly advanced propulsion systems in the 1940s, but miraculously kept them entirely secret for 80 years while spending trillions of dollars on conventional equipment that this technology would render utterly obsolete. That theory is frankly fanciful. Moreover, it fails to address two additional phenomena: military officials who claim the US studies UFOs in secret, and thousands of people who say they've met non-human creatures near these unusual craft. In sum, the leading UFO hypothesis among ostensibly serious people in media, academia, and government is a logical non-starter. How has this combination of credulity-stretching speculation and head-in-the-sand denial become the dominant worldview of our cultural elite? The answer is partly stigma-driven groupthink, which should embarrass us far more than it apparently does. Shame on the scientists who claim to follow the evidence objectively but glibly ignore thousands of primary source accounts. Shame on the politicians who exercise inadequate oversight of our military and intelligence agencies. Shame on the journalists who fail to hold any of these parties accountable. And shame on us if we don't demand better. The surprising fact is that alien visitors are the simplest explanation for the strangest UAP. Let me state that again. The simplest explanation for the flying objects we have failed to identify for 80 years is that some of them are non-human technology. This is basic reasoning, not a far-fetched claim. To the contrary, every other theory is objectively more complicated and therefore rationally less intuitive. All the alien hypothesis requires to be likely is advanced propulsion capacity, the very quality UAP demonstrate most clearly. Where is our curiosity about this? Proving aliens are on Earth will be the biggest story in human history. It holds the promise of profound progress and radical updates to our understanding of reality. Scientists should develop field studies and censor standards. Journalists should cover these efforts and get public officials on the record. Lawmakers should investigate military intelligence agencies and declassify relevant information. If unelected civil servants hid revelations about the nature of reality while secretly taking them seriously, they may have been trying to protect us, but they contravened the Enlightenment values of our liberal democracy. The passive incuriosity of our leading scientists and journalists should disappoint us just as much. UFO skepticism is not rational caution, it's unscientific denial, and it's blocking our progress toward what may be the greatest discovery in any of our lifetimes. Some UAP are likely non-human technology. It's time to stop debating this obvious possibility and start confirming it rigorously so we can get to work on the world-changing opportunities and challenges it reveals. Thank you. Essay over. So I'll just unpack a couple of things here. The very simple high-level argument, as you've no doubt intuited, is that we see UAP demonstrating advanced propulsion. We have seen UAP demonstrating advanced propulsion for 80 years. It's extremely unlikely that humans developed advanced propulsion 80 years ago, and therefore it is extremely unlikely that UFOs have a human origin, which means it is extremely likely that UFOs have a non-human origin. And this should be pretty intuitive. It's a pretty straightforward set of claims. I guess one useful thing to do then would be to address the most intuitive source of skepticism about this, which I'm getting from my smart friends. And that's that basically everyone is confused, that all the people who have reported UFOs have just been confused for different reasons. They saw something that they interpreted as an unidentified flying object when in fact it was the weather or a reflection or an identifiable flying object that they just couldn't identify at the time. And I think this position sounds sane on the surface, but when you dial in and read the tens and then hundreds and then thousands of reports, it falls apart pretty quickly. The problem is you can't get people to do that reading. You can't force them to engage with all 800 reports in Passport to Magonia or every researched UFO sighting in Project Blue Book, for example. There are truly dozens of high quality UFO reports. And we know for sure that at least the ones that we're seeing in the 21st century have been identified as physical objects, or some significant percentage of them are physical objects. And we know that for a fact because we have them on multiple sensor arrays, different kinds of sensors measuring different things like heat and motion and physical density. I don't know much about these sensor arrays. I don't want to waste your time too much more, but I'd like to just touch a few more ideas. One is this scientific revolution idea, which comes from philosopher Thomas Kuhn. Really interesting book, worth reading, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and worth considering, I think, that we're in this moment before a paradigm shift because a lot of people are kind of getting their epistemology, their like understanding of knowledge here from impressions of other people's impressions. So we don't think there's a there there because other people aren't acting like there's a there there. So there's this like mimetic ignorance that's just spreading throughout. We're not getting any bigger, but holding fast in many of the academic institutions that should otherwise, by rights, be very interested in this subject. And so something I've been thinking about a lot is if you asked anybody pre-Galileo if the Earth revolved around the sun, they would have thought you were crazy. And if you ask people pre-Darwin if we evolved from monkeys, a lot of scientists would have said that's wrong. And if you'd asked people before Einstein about gravitational forces and space-time, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. So we are in a situation like that right now. And when you ask most scientists if UAP are non-human intelligence, they're going to say that's silly because they just don't know. But something to remember is that science changes radically over time. It's not very long ago, it's literally 128 years ago that leading scientists like Lord Kelvin thought human flight with anything other than balloons was going to be physically impossible. That's 128 years ago from now. So people saying that warp drives are impossible today might be wrong. It's entirely feasible that we're going to come up with better propulsion technology than we currently have. And I think that's another big roadblock for people's intuitions about UFOs being likely. So I mentioned that the only thing really holding back the idea of alien visitors from feeling intuitive to people is this sense that it's really hard to get around in the galaxy because things are very far apart. So that comes from a very strong intuition that there's not going to be a faster than light mode of travel, which, as far as we know, for the last like 80 years is true. But again, 128 years ago, we thought we couldn't even fly planes. We thought that was physically impossible. So it seems reasonable to expect that we'll have a better understanding of physical propulsion capabilities 200 years from now. And it seems at least possible that one of the things we're going to discover is that we can go faster than light. So if a civilization had 1,000 or 1,000,000 years ahead of us, on us, if they had 1,000 years of extra time, it seems likely that they might have better propulsion technology. I'm going to just be circling around the same stuff now. What I'm really trying to do, broad picture, is make this feel intuitive for folks. I'm sure you're on a mission like that too. If you're like me, actually, you might be experiencing kind of epistemic loneliness around this subject. Say you are so ignored, you feel so ignored by mainstream thinking and by your friends who think that UFOs are not NHI, that you can feel lost sometimes intellectually. And I think you can start to even doubt your own intuitions. You can feel gaslit by the scientific establishment or by your skeptical friends. And I guess in part, this is an effort to help you feel like you're not crazy. You are not crazy. If you think UFOs are probably NHI, that is a rational, sane position to be holding. You could maybe debate the particulars of what percentage you assign as a likelihood to that, but it is very reasonable to expect that it is likely that we're going to find out that UFOs are non-human intelligence. And you should feel good about that. So I'll leave you there with you feeling good. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this, please consider sharing it anywhere or just giving me any kind of feedback. I'm on X at WTUFO Show, or you can come find us online at WTUFO.com. All right. Thank you very much. Keep watching the skies. Skis. Skies.